It's hard to believe that 2016 is already as distant as it is. A lot of things happened that year, and while one's mileage may vary as to the quality of those things, personally for me, I found a sort of nihilistic amusement in all of it. Independently of all the goings on that year, I was in what was probably the worst crisis of my life up to that point, which put me in a mood of wanting to watch the world burn. It wasn't my finest hour, but 2016 wasn't without its highs. Seeing Rogue One the night it came out was one. Seeing one of my favorite Japanese groups live for the first time was another one. But probably the biggest one in gaming for me at the time was the release of Doom. As much as I would like to say that I was there at day one on release of Doom 2016, I can't really say I was. I mean, I was there when the game released, but I didn't buy it, mostly because I had nothing to play it on. As much as I wasn't in the best place mentally, so too was it that I wasn't in the best place for my console collection, nor was it conceivable at the time that I could buy a PlayStation 4 or Xbox One. I did, however, have a PC which could play games, and indeed, I did use to play games. While there is a YouTube channel out there that does test modern games like Doom and even Doom Eternal on the same hardware, I was far from confident that my laptop's quad-core AMD A6 APU had the grunt to run Doom at an acceptable level, no matter how optimized the game's engine was for low-spec hardware. Later that year, I did upgrade to a Lenovo IdeaPad with a dual-core i5 CPU and a GeForce 940 MX graphics card, but even then, I was left with a lot of uncertainty and questions on how capable an entry-level Fortnite computer would be able to run one of the biggest AAA games of the day. Of course, these days, I now know it could have, but nowadays that computer is so far past its prime, most people would have probably thrown it out years ago. None of this stopped me from enjoying the game, though. While it would be a few years before I would first experience the game for myself, there were a litany of YouTube channels, specifically in the commentary community, who used gameplay from Doom in the background of their videos. There would be channels like Leafy is Here and Some Ordinary Gamers especially. I would watch their videos, sometimes exclusively for the Doom gameplay, just to see what the game was like. The game looked amazing and was the first game of that generation that looked to me like a genuine next-generation game. We were still in the closing stage of the cross-generation phase for the 7th generation consoles at the time, so there were a few games still coming out for Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Doom didn't, and thanks to this they could finally demonstrate what was possible on the latest console and PC hardware. Even just watching the gameplay, I couldn't help but to get the sense that Doom was an amazing game. I had become a fan of Doom years before, after playing Doom on the Super Nintendo and Doom 3 on the original Xbox. Ironically enough, both of these were considered impossible ports in their day. While the SNES version was more of a novelty even in its day, the Xbox version of Doom 3 was a technical showpiece that demonstrated how talented performers could take one of the most demanding PC games of its day and get it to run on hardware it seemed on paper to have no business running on, let alone getting it to run well. This was easily, across the entire series, the best console version of a contemporaneous Doom game ever made. And then Doom 2016 came on the Switch. Coming to Nintendo's then new hybrid console, many initially doubted just what the fledgling half-home console, half-handheld could really do with its worryingly low-spec Tegra X1 SoC. Coming to Switch just shortly after launch, what better way to prove the Switch's hardware capabilities than to port over the latest and most demanding FPS? The result? A great-looking, albeit downscaled version of the game running at a locked 30 FPS. While quaint to today's standard, in 2017, this sort of performance on a low-spec tablet was nothing shy of mind-blowing. While it wasn't necessarily going to convert others from the PS4 or Xbox One, or especially PC, what the Switch port did offer was the full, unrestricted Doom experience on a device that was cheaper and therefore more accessible to more people. It was at a halved frame rate, sure, but perfectly playable, and to the untrained eye, the game looked just as good. I was entranced in the idea that this sort of game could signify the future of what was possible on gaming hardware, and I knew that when the time and place were right, I too would be able to experience the game for myself for the first time. Late in 2020, I was able to secure myself a new gaming PC. This one was equipped with an i7 6-core CPU, an RTX 2060, and 16 gigabytes of RAM. I had no more worries about my computer's ability to run current and future AAA games. I finally bought, downloaded, and installed Doom 2016, and after all the gameplay and reviews of it I had seen up to that point, it became even clearer to me just how incredible this game was. It was unlike any shooter I had ever played before. My only real closest point of reference for it would have been either Quake or Quake 2 perhaps. But even still, it expanded on the arena shooter gameplay in such a way which made it almost impossible to compare to other games, at least other FPS games by id. Doom, Doom 2, and Doom 64 all have moments where you will open a door into an arena where a large number of enemies are either lying in wait or end up spawning in. These moments are definitely most prominent in Doom 2 and Doom 64. These are easily some of the most intense moments in these games, and they have really helped to define the Doom series' reputation of one guy taking on hordes of enemies. The finales to both Doom 2 and Doom 64 epitomize this. Thanks mostly to technological limitations at the time, Doom 3 had to walk this aspect of the series back pretty significantly. While I will always love what Doom 3 achieved in its gameplay and presentation, I did wonder if it would be possible to do in 3D with modern tech that the old pseudo 3D games did back in the day. The answer was a resounding yes. Every arena you walk into in Doom 2016 has the same level of intensity as the most intense moments in the previous Doom and Quake games. Every arena is its own climax. The number of enemies that spawn in per arena quickly begin to match much later parts of previous games and quickly outpace them in the escalation of their intensity. The escalation of intensity comes not only from the number of enemies you encounter, but also the combination of types of enemies you encounter. Of course, we had a similar aspect to this in previous games, especially Doom 64, but here it is really amped up as it forces you to optimize your movement and prioritize which enemies to take on in what order. This is further compounded by the added dimension of verticality in those arenas. In previous games, thanks to the technological limitations of the engines in use at the time, large geometrically complex vertical arenas weren't possible for one reason or another. These 90s games were restricted by the fact that they weren't rendered in real 3D and used rendering technologies that prioritized draw speeds, which made the games run smoothly. This problem would eventually be solved by LucasArts with their Jedi engine and 3D Realms build engine. Of course, it would go on to pioneer real-time 3D engines instead of solving problems regarding verticality and pseudo 3D ones. So as these original Doom games would go, we would have to wait until the release of Doom 3 to get a full 3D Doom. But even then, taking on successive waves of enemies was really out of the question for Doom 3, considering the emphasis of id Tech 4 was placed on a robust dynamic lighting system, which already taxed the console and PC hardware available at the time enough as it was. While Doom 2016 isn't necessarily throwing large hordes of enemies at you constantly in the same way as the classic Doom games, it does manage its own approximation to that by having different open arenas where enemies can spawn in groups or waves. It can get tricky in the end of the game, especially on higher difficulties when the enemies move faster and hit harder. I would say that it encourages your weapon choice in any given scenario, but that wouldn't be entirely true. It was fairly quickly discovered that Doom 2016's weapon balancing wasn't entirely perfect. Of course, you had the BFG, which could be your screen nuke, but ammo for that was always so sparse you can't rely on it as your primary weapon. But it is kind of rendered obsolete when you learn the unbeatable Super Shotgun Siege Mode Gauss Gun combo. If you can master this, enemies have been shown to melt away, even the bigger, scarier guys. Since this can easily be exploited once discovered, I can understand how some might come away from this game with a mild sense of disappointment. In a big way, challenges even at the higher difficulties can be cheesed by this combo, and it isn't cheating and seems to be the game's predominant strategy. It can make being good at the game feel a bit hollow. It's really undeniable, but I choose to see past it. This isn't meant to sound like a humble brag or anything. I don't blame anyone for not, especially after the release of Doom Eternal. But when I say I choose to see past it, I mean to say that this flaw in the gameplay doesn't necessarily bother me so much against the backdrop of the game's big picture. The gameplay, of course, I enjoy a lot. I wouldn't insist on returning to it so often if I didn't find the gameplay to be fun and interesting, cheese and all. But I also love the music. The soundtrack is killer. While of course there are times when the music might seem to err on the side of harsh noise, in some instances, I love it all the same. The art design is great too. I remember looking at the designs of the enemies like the Imps, Mancubus, and Revenant, and liking how similar yet different they were to the models in Doom 3. It's arbitrary to most, but as someone who regularly revisits Doom 3 and loves that game too, seeing how these models have evolved as 3D rendered characters since the previous game gave me the sensation of returning home even upon my first playthrough. The same goes for the UAC Mars base's overall aesthetic. While quite different, more futuristic and robust than the UAC Mars facility in Doom 3, which was much more drab and industrial, there are still yet certain visual callbacks to the latter that just make me smile. And that might sound a bit strange, right? Doom, a game with such an unapologetic dedication to the visceral, would make me smile. Not in a maniacal way like Doom Guy when he picks up the BFG for the first time in the classic games, but in an unironic, glad way. A way that one might imagine someone reacting to their favorite movie or TV show or cozy game of choice. When I asked myself why this is, the answer turned out to be a lot deeper than I expected. Doom 2016 was a significant release for the Doom series. Despite how much I love Doom 3 for its differences, to the other games in the series, those differences, I can't deny, did raise a number of eyebrows, and the similar direction taken with Quake 4 probably raised concerns about the gameplay direction for the future of both series. While hints to some elements of Doom 2016's actual gameplay would be present in the infamous Call of Doom trailer, even more questions about the integrity of Doom's core gameplay and what made Doom Doom began to go around as the previous raised eyebrows would turn into real concern. Was Doom 4 going to fall in line with the Call of Duty style scripted military shooter style that was so prominent in that time? There was already a growing fatigue of that formula festering, waiting to be agitated by yet another legendary FPS series to go down that route to nearly every fan's disappointment. But finally in 2016, we got Doom. Not Doom 4, just Doom. At the time, it carried the feeling of a series reboot, and while of course the lore declares otherwise, the gameplay, I argue, was a manifesto for the future of how the series would play. Now, almost a decade later, as we await the release of Doom: The Dark Age, a game which promises the truest return to form to the original games that has ever been done in real 3D, and upon all the innovations to the gameplay that made Doom Eternal and its expansions nearly perfect the gameplay in Doom 2016, which itself was meant to be, once again, a faithful recreation of Doom's original gameplay. Despite the series constantly chasing the intent of the original games, and apparently making compromises in the last two games, keeping it from that goal, the fact that these games have insisted on evolving is pretty inspiring. I mentioned before that I was in the midst of my worst year personally when Doom came out in 2016. Revisiting that game now comes with the sensation of looking back at a time with the aid of hindsight, with the feeling of, look how far we've come. Doom as a series has come a long way since being crammed onto mobile SoCs and APUs on anemic console hardware. The game was impressive for its time, but look how far the series has come already. The developers have made it clear that their aim is to continually deliver unique experiences that keep in the spirit of what made the series so important in the first place. They didn't just stick with the trends. They didn't just rest on their laurels with Doom 2016 or just remake Doom Eternal and call it a sequel. Id has made it clear through their action, Doom won't just settle on the comfortable thing. Doom and Quake were always about pushing what was possible with available technology forward, and that aspect has driven the direction of the gameplay. This constant drive to push forward and dodge complacency is a spirit that I really resonate with, and in that way, it is inspiring. So I smile when I go back to Doom. As I watch that epic opening in the elevator, as the Doomslayer listens to Samuel Hayden talk about his altruistic intentions while juxtaposed to the innocent dead scattered throughout the installation, I'm reminded of the challenges I faced at the time when this game came out, and how quaint those challenges were compared to what I might face now. And yet these new challenges don't make these times worse than then. And that fact alone tells me just how much stronger and improved I've become. Look how far we've come. Some might seek to avoid revisiting something that reminds them of a bad feeling, but in my experience, strong personal growth promises that those feelings don't have to stay bad in retrospect. Like anything else, feelings are intertextual, and anything as great as Doom 2016 reminding me just how much better things are for me now than when it came out is always a good feeling. And that is why, in spite of its flaws, Doom 2016 is still one of the best games.